It all started on a quiet Saturday morning when I was finally getting around to fixing the squeaky hinges on the back door, the kind of home project that sits on your to do list forever until it finally drives you crazy enough to tackle it. And little did I know that the simple act of pulling out a screwdriver and oil would be the first domino in a chain of events that turned into one of the wildest encounters I've ever had with the dreaded HOA and their self appointed queen bee, the woman. Everyone in the neighborhood not so lovingly called Karen, though of course her actual name was something else that I'll leave unsaid because the shoe fit too perfectly, and the truth is, Karen had made a hobby of patrolling our cul-de-sac as if it were her personal fiefdom, clipboard in hand, muttering about violations and standards whenever a car parked at the wrong angle or a lawn dared to have a dandelion, and for months she'd been escalating her campaign of control toward me and my wife after we had the audacity to say no when she demanded that we repaint our shutters in the proof shade of beige, a decision that somehow felt like a declaration of war to her because she'd corner me at the mailbox and whisper about fine threaten letters and call emergency meetings of the HOA board just to single me out. But that morning I wasn't thinking about her at all. I was focused on the hinges, humming to myself, until I noticed something strange, the sound of footsteps, crunching across my gravel driveway, even though I hadn't invited anyone over and wasn't expecting delivery. So I set down my tools, wiped my hands on my jeans, and leaned around the side of the house just in time to see Karen herself, bold as brass, fiddling with the lock on my front door, as if she had every right in the world to be there. And my first reaction was disbelief, because who in their right mind just walks up to someone else's house and starts testing keys? But disbelief quickly gave way to anger when I realized she wasn't just testing, she had actually inserted a key and was twisting it, trying to gain entry into my home like she owned the place, and I felt my pulse spike as I shouted her name across the yard, demanding to know what she thought she was doing, but she only glanced over her shoulder with that smug little smirk she wore whenever she thought she'd caught me in some kind of violation, and she said something about inspection rights and safety checks as if she were the sheriff of the block, and I stormed forward, my hands clenched, reminding her that this was my private property and she had no legal authority whatsoever. But before I could reach her, she actually managed to turn the lock and crack the door open, and that was the moment my wife, who had just finished her night shift and was napping on the couch in her police uniform because she hadn't even bothered to change, stirred awake and sat up, blinking at the noise and the sight of Karen half inside our living room must have shocked her just as much as it shocked me, because she jumped up instantly, all training kicking in, and confronted the intruder with a sharp, commanding voice that echoed through the entryway, the kind of tone that instantly makes people freeze. And I'll never forget the look on Karen's face when she suddenly realized the woman she had tried to bargain on was not only my wife, but also a fully sworn officer of the law, badge gleaming on her chest, sidearm strapped at her hip, posture radiating authority. And in that split second, Karen's confidence melted into panic, her smirk collapsing into a wide-eyed grimace as she stammered excuses, claiming she was just checking on a possible violation and had no intention of actually entering. But of course the evidence of the key still dangling from the lock said otherwise, and my wife, in her calm but firm way, told her to step back immediately and explain herself, while I came up behind, shaking with rage, but trying to hold it together, and Karen, rather than admit wrongdoing, did what Karens do best. She doubled down, crossing her arms and huffing that we were overreacting, and that as HOA president she had every right to access our home for inspection purposes, which was such an outrageous lie that I almost laughed. But before I could, my wife cut her off and informed her in no uncertain terms that what she had just attempted could easily be considered trespassing, unlawful. Entry, even burglary, charges that carried real weight. And you could see the gears turning in Karen's head as she realized the trouble she might actually be in. But instead of backing down gracefully, she tried to flip the script by pulling out her phone and dialing 911 right there on my porch, loudly announcing that she was reporting a hostile homeowner and possible domestic disturbance, clearly hoping to turn the situation around by summoning reinforcements. And I stood there, dumbfounded, at her audacity, because she had literally been caught unlocking my door without permission, and yet she still thought the police would side with her. But what she hadn't calculated was that my wife was not just a random homeowner, but an officer who worked in the very department she was calling, which meant that within seconds the dispatcher on the other end would know exactly who she was dealing with. And the irony of the whole scene was almost too much to bear, because here was Karen, clutching her phone with trembling fingers, trying to summon the law against us, completely unaware that the law was already standing right in front of her in full uniform, arms folded, eyes unblinking, waiting to see how far Karen would take her charade. And that right there was the beginning of a showdown that none of the neighbors could have imagined when they peeked through their blinds that morning, but one that would soon become the talk of the entire community. Karen stood frozen on the porch, the phone pressed against her ear, her words tumbling out in a rushed, high-pitched stream as she told the dispatcher that she was being threatened by dangerous homeowners, deliberately twisting the situation to make herself sound like the victim. But my wife, cool and collected in her uniform, simply folded her arms and let her dig herself deeper, because there's something about watching someone confidently lie to authority when the authority is literally standing in front of them that makes the whole thing feel surreal. And I couldn't help but marvel at Karen's nerve, or maybe her stupidity, because she wasn't just bending the truth, she was fabricating a story that would instantly collapse the moment responding officers arrived. Yet she went on, describing me as aggressive, describing my wife as a stranger impersonating an officer. And I swear my jaw dropped at that, because there she was staring straight at the badge, the name tag, the radio, the full tactical belt, and still decided the best play was to claim impersonation, which was not only reckless but also a felony accusation. And my wife raised an eyebrow, gave me a little shake of her head that said don't interrupt, and continued watching her like a hawk. And when Karen finished her frantic call with a huff and stuffed the phone back in her bag, she tried to reassert control by standing taller and insisting that the police are on their way and they'll straighten this out, as if she had just summoned cavalry to crush us. But the irony dripped so thick, I almost burst out laughing, because the police were literally part of my household. And if she thought she was about to stage some grand HOA victory, she was about to be sorely disappointed. And the tension in that moment hung heavy, the three of us locked in a bizarre standoff, Karen clutching her clipboard now, like a shield, me clenching my fists with every urge to shout her down, and my wife standing like a statue of calm power, her uniform practically glowing in the morning sunlight. And then, right on cue, the faint wail of sirens drifted down the street, growing louder by the second, until two cruisers rolled into view and stopped at the curb, doors popping open as three officers stepped out, scanning the scene with professional precision. And Karen's entire demeanor shifted instantly, her smugness returning as she waved her arms and shouted, "Over here, officers! This is the house. This is where the disturbance is happening." And she actually ran halfway down the walkway to greet them, like she was leading them into battle. And I exchanged a look with my wife, who simply muttered, "Watch this," under her breath, because the second the lead officer saw her standing in uniform on our porch, his entire expression changed from alert readiness to easy recognition, and he broke into a smile, greeting her by name. "Hey, Sergeant, didn't expect to see you here." And that one sentence shattered Karen's confidence like glass, because she stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth hanging open as she processed that not only was my wife a real cop, but she was actually higher ranking than the officers who had just arrived. And the lead officer glanced at me with curiosity before turning his attention back to my wife, asking her what was going on, and Karen, desperate not to lose the narrative, jumped in front, waving her clipboard, shouting over everyone that she had caught us violating HOA standards, and that my wife was impersonating to intimidate her, and the officer frowned, cutting her off with a raised hand, saying, "Ma'am, slow down impersonating? That's a serious claim." And Karen doubled down, insisting she knew real uniforms when she saw them, which made the two younger officers behind him snicker under their breath, because the idea that a suburban HOA president could distinguish authentic police attire better than cops themselves was absurd. And my wife finally stepped forward, producing her badge, her ID, even her radio, which buzzed at that exact moment with chatter from dispatch, a perfect piece of timing that silenced everyone. And she calmly explained that Karen had attempted to use a key to unlock our front door without permission, that I had witnessed it firsthand, and that when confronted, Karen had escalated by calling 911 with false claims, and as she laid it all out, steady and professional, the officers' faces hardened, turning toward Karen with a mixture of disbelief and annoyance, and Karen, sensing the shift, tried to backpedal, her words stumbling now, saying she only wanted to check for safety hazards, and that sometimes homeowners hide things that affect property values, and the lead officer pinched the bridge of his nose, clearly running out of patience, telling her flatly, "Ma'am, that's not how the law works. You can't just unlock someone's home. That's trespassing." And I felt a surge of vindication, like every ounce of frustration I'd bottled up from months of Karen's harassment was finally being acknowledged, but she wasn't finished yet. She snapped back that as HOA president, she had authority, waving her clipboard like it was a badge of its own, but the officer cut her off again, firmer this time, saying HOAs don't override state law. This isn't your property. You don't have rights here. And you could practically see the defeat wash over her, her face flushing bright red as she looked from one officer to the next, searching for even a scrap of support, but all she found were narrowed eyes and folded arms. And then came the kicker. My wife, in that measured voice she used when addressing rookies, asked the officers if they'd like to see the key Karen had used to try and enter, and she plucked it right out of the lock, where it was still hanging, holding it up like Exhibit A. And the lead officer's jaw tightened, because that single piece of evidence transformed everything from, as he said, into a clear, attempted, unlawful entry. And for the first time, Karen's voice cracked as she stammered about extra copies issued by the developer and misunderstandings, but the excuses fell flat, and the officer told her plainly that she was dangerously close to earning herself a pair of handcuffs. And the silence that followed was so thick you could hear the leaves rustling in the breeze, until finally Karen sputtered that she wanted her lawyer, clutching her clipboard tighter than ever, and I realized with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief that for the first time since we'd moved into that neighborhood, the HOA tyrant was finally on the defensive, and this was only the beginning of what would spiral into a full-blown neighborhood reckoning. The tension outside our house was so thick, it felt like the entire cul-de-sac had stopped breathing. And sure enough, when I glanced around, I noticed blinds cracked open, curtains shifting, and silhouettes of neighbors who had been quietly watching this drama unfold from the safety of their windows. Because nothing travels faster in a suburban HOA neighborhood than the scent of scandal, and today, they were witnessing the unthinkable, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, Karen, being scolded by actual police officers on the porch she had just tried to break into. And though part of me wanted to grin at the poetic justice, I also knew the situation wasn't finished because Karen was the type who would rather set herself on fire than admit she was wrong. And right on cue, she drew herself up, clutching her clipboard like it contained divine authority, and began rattling off a stream of justifications that only made her sound more desperate, saying she had been tipped off that my property might contain prohibited alterations, that she was legally empowered to investigate potential risks, and that homeowners who resisted inspections could be fined or even evicted, which was such a twisting of HOA guidelines that even the junior officer couldn't help but roll his eyes, and when the lead officer reminded her firmly that HOA rules did not grant her access to private residences, she fired back with a tirade about property values, neighborhood standards, and the duty of leadership she bore, her voice rising higher with each excuse, until she practically shrieked that if they didn't side with her, the entire neighborhood would collapse into chaos. And I swear if the situation hadn't been so tense, I might have doubled over laughing, because the idea that my slightly squeaky door hinges or the color of my shutters could trigger an apocalyptic collapse of suburban society was so absurd it belonged in a sitcom. But Karen wasn't joking. She was deadly serious. And as she ranted, she gestured wildly toward my wife, accusing her once again of posing as law enforcement. And that's when my wife, who had been remarkably patient, finally took a step closer, her boots clicking against the porch boards with deliberate authority, and held her badge directly in front of Karen's face, not just flashing it, but holding it steady long enough that Karen had to either acknowledge it or keep lying to herself. And then my wife spoke in a low, commanding voice that carried the weight of every hour she'd spent on the force. "I am a sworn officer of this city. You attempted unlawful entry into my home. You then made a false police report that's obstruction, trespassing, and potentially attempted burglary. Do you want me to list more charges? And Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, no words coming out, because even she knew that when a cop puts things in terms that clear, the ground beneath you is crumbling fast. And yet she still tried one last Hail Mary, sputtering that she was being harassed and targeted, pointing at me and claiming I had a history of violations. But the lead officer calmly asked her to produce evidence, any documented proof, any official complaint, and when. She started flipping through her clipboard. It was almost comical because all she had were hand-scribbled notes about grass height and suspicious curtain colors, nothing resembling real violations. And as she stammered, the junior officer muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous, but loud enough for everyone to hear." And I noticed movement on the sidewalk where a couple of Boulder neighbors had actually stepped outside, inching closer, phones in hand, recording the scene for posterity. And Karen noticed too, because she whipped around, screaming at them to go back inside, yelling that official business was being conducted, which only made more neighbors pour out curious and emboldened. And suddenly it wasn't just me and my wife versus Karen. It was the entire block finally witnessing her antics in the open, with police officers there to validate what many of them had only whispered about in private, and the weight of collective judgment began pressing down on Karen in real time, her voice trembling now as she tried to reassert authority. But every attempt came out weaker, more frantic, like the unraveling of a dictator who suddenly realizes the crowd isn't afraid anymore. And I'll never forget the moment one of the neighbors, Mr. Lawson, an older gentleman who had lived here for decades, stepped forward and called out, "Karen, enough is enough. We've all had it with your nonsense." And his words were met with murmurs of agreement, even applause from someone in the back, and Karen spun around, her face red as a beet, sputtering about how they were all ungrateful and didn't appreciate her sacrifices. But the damage was done, the facade was cracked, and now the police had seen firsthand how little credibility she had. And as the crowd grew, the lead officer looked at my wife and said, "Sergeant, would you like to handle this?" Which was his way of recognizing both her jurisdiction and her personal stake in the matter, and she nodded, stepping forward until she was practically nose to nose with Karen. And in that calm but lethal tone she used when giving suspects one last chance, she told her, "You need to leave this property immediately. You need to stop harassing this household. If you step foot here again without invitation, I will press full charges. Do you understand me?" And the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the cruiser engines and the faint buzz of a neighbor's camera phone. And Karen, cornered on all sides, finally muttered something unintelligible before turning on her heel and storming down the walkway, her clipboard clutched so tightly her knuckles were white. And as she passed the officer, she hissed something about not being finished, but her voice lacked conviction, and for the first time in months, maybe years, the balance of power in our little corner of suburbia had shifted, and though she had retreated for now, I knew deep down that Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly, that this was just the opening act of a battle she'd be too stubborn to abandon. And part of me almost welcomed it, because after what had just unfolded, after the way my wife had stood tall, in uniform, and the way the neighbors had rallied, I knew Karen's reign of terror was finally beginning to crumble. After Karen stormed off down the sidewalk, muttering to herself about lawsuits and restoring order, the street seemed to exhale collectively, neighbors slowly lowering their phones, the police officers exchanging looks of relief that the confrontation hadn't escalated into something uglier, and me standing there with a cocktail of emotions swirling through my chest, anger, satisfaction, disbelief, and no small amount of exhaustion, because while it felt good to finally see Karen's arrogance punctured, I also knew enough about her persistence to recognize that this wasn't over, that she would retreat for now, only to regroup and come back with some new scheme. But for the moment, there was a strange sense of unity in the air. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact with me for months suddenly stepping forward, offering nods of support, even pats on the shoulder, and a few whispered about their own horror stories with Karen, like Mrs. Delaney mentioning how Karen had once threatened to fine her for having wind chimes that were too loud, or the young couple across the street who admitted Karen had peeked over their fence taking pictures of their backyard. And I realized then that this wasn't just about me and my wife. It was about everyone. We had all been under her thumb, and now that thumb had finally been pried back, just enough to let in some sunlight. And as the officers wrapped up, my wife gave them a brief nod of thanks, the kind of professional courtesy that comes from working alongside them for years, and one of them chuckled as he walked back to his cruiser, saying, "Good luck with that one, Sergeant. She's a piece of work," which made me laugh harder than I had in days, the tension draining from my shoulders at last. And when the cruisers pulled away, the crowd of neighbors lingered, buzzing like bees in a hive, their whispered conversations growing louder as people compared notes. And for the first time, Karen's iron grip on the neighborhood. Narrative seemed broken, but just as I started to relax, my wife leaned close and whispered in my ear, "Don't get too comfortable. She'll come back, and next time she'll be sneakier." And I knew she was right because Karen wasn't someone who accepted defeat. She was someone who treated every setback as fuel for a grudge. And sure enough, the very next day, we got the first taste of her counterattack in the form of a thick envelope slid under our door, stuffed with formal violation notices for everything from having a non-regulation welcome mat to the improper positioning of our trash cans, and stapled to the front was a typed letter dripping with condescension, accusing us of endangering neighborhood standards and warning us of escalating fines unless we complied. And though part of me wanted to rip it up and toss it in the fireplace, my wife reminded me that every paper trail she left behind was evidence that the smarter move was to collect everything, document every interaction, and prepare for the storm. And she was right, because over the next week, Karen escalated her campaign, showing up at board meetings where she ranted about rogue homeowners, plastering passive-aggressive flyers on doors about the importance of obedience to HOA leadership, even cornering neighbors on the street to spin her version of events, though from the looks she got, fewer and fewer people were buying into her narrative. And meanwhile, I found myself turning into an amateur detective, snapping photos of every notice, recording dates and times of her appearances, compiling a growing dossier that looked less like a list of violations against me, and more like a case file against her. And through it all, my wife remained calm, steady, focused, reminding me that law enforcement was about patience and precision, not rash reactions, and that Karen would eventually hang herself with the very rope she was weaving. But that didn't stop the daily frustrations, like the morning I found her squatting near our flower beds taking pictures of our soil, claiming we were using non-approved fertilizer, or the afternoon when I caught her scribbling notes about the way we parked my truck in the driveway, muttering about aesthetic uniformity. And each encounter was another test of restraint because every fiber of me wanted to shout, but I knew that shouting was exactly what she wanted, something to twist, something to escalate. So instead, I bit my tongue and watched her dig her own grave. And the turning point came one evening when we were having dinner on the patio and noticed flashing lights down the block, another police cruiser pulling up to a neighbor's house, and at first I thought maybe it was unrelated until I saw Karen striding toward the officers, papers in hand, animatedly pointing at the neighbor's yard as though she had called them in. And from across the way, we could hear the exasperated tone of the officer as he tried to explain to her, again, that HOA rules weren't criminal law. And when the neighbor, a mild-mannered schoolteacher named Grant, stepped outside confused, Karen accused him of harboring dangerous materials in his garage because he had gardening supplies stacked too high. And it hit me in that moment that she wasn't just targeting us, she was spiraling, her hunger for control growing wilder and more irrational. And neighbors were beginning to see it clearly for themselves, not just through stories or gossip, but through her public meltdowns. And as much as I wanted to feel relieved, my wife's words echoed in my head, "She's not done yet." And sure enough, only days later, the situation escalated in a way that would drag the entire HOA board and eventually the law itself into the spotlight. Because Karen wasn't going to fade quietly, she was going to go out swinging, and she had just started winding up. Karen's counterattack reached a whole new level when she decided to weaponize the HOA board itself, transforming what had once been a sleepy group of retirees and reluctant volunteers into her personal army, or at least that was what she attempted, because at the next monthly HOA meeting, which was usually sparsely attended, she orchestrated what looked like a coup, arriving with binders, a projector, and a stack of freshly printed evidence packets that she dramatically slapped down on the folding tables as though she were presenting a criminal case in front of the Supreme Court. And I remember walking into that meeting with my wife, expecting the usual 10 minutes of budget updates and landscaping talk, only to find nearly every chair filled, neighbors buzzing nervously as Karen marched up and down like a general preparing troops for battle. And as soon as the meeting was called to order, she launched into a tirade, pointing directly at me and accusing me of being a repeat violator, disruptive neighbor, and dangerous influence on community safety, waving her clipboard for emphasis. And though a few neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, most sat with crossed arms, skeptical but curious, waiting to see what circus act she was about to unleash. And unleash she did, projecting photos of my truck parked half an inch over the driveway line, my grass slightly longer after a week of rain, even a blurry snapshot of my wife's police cruiser when she had parked at home in uniform, claiming that the mere presence of a law enforcement vehicle created an atmosphere of intimidation, and the absurdity of it all was almost too much to bear. But I bit my tongue, remembering my wife's advice, because she was sitting beside me in full composure, arms folded, eyes steady, silently daring Karen to cross a line she couldn't uncross, and Karen, emboldened by the sound of her own voice, did exactly that, claiming that my wife had abused her authority by confronting her during the porch incident, spinning the story to make it sound like she had been the one cornered and threatened. And then she did the unthinkable. She proposed a motion to have us fined heavily, censured, and even considered for removal from the neighborhood, which drew gasps from a few people in the room, because while everyone had tolerated her antics before, this was the first time she had openly tried to exile someone, and it was clear from the murmurs that her power was starting to slip, because instead of nods of agreement, she was met with questions, pointed ones, like Mr. Lawson raising his hand and asking what authority she thought she had to override state tenancy laws, or Mrs. Delaney pointing out that her so-called evidence looked more like harassment than legitimate documentation, and the young couple across the street chimed in that Karen had been caught snooping in their backyard too, their voices trembling but firm. And as more neighbors spoke up, Karen's face reddened, her voice growing shriller as she tried to shout them down, insisting that she was the only thing standing between order and chaos, and that if they didn't stand with her, they were standing against her. And I watched the tide shift in real time, watched the crowd lean away from her, watched the board members exchange uneasy looks, until finally the HOA treasurer, a quiet man who rarely said more than 2 words at meetings, cleared his throat and said plainly, "Karen, this isn't what the HOA is for. You've gone too far." And the room fell silent, the weight of those words landing like a hammer, because for the first time, someone from within her own circle had drawn a line, and she didn't know how to handle it, sputtering about bylaws and obligations, but her arguments grew weaker as the board members one by one began distancing themselves, until the president, yes, the actual president, because Karen was only vice president despite how she acted, finally slammed his gavel and declared the motion invalid, reminding her that HOAs handle maintenance and budgets, not witch hunts against homeowners. And the applause that erupted after that moment was like a dam breaking, neighbors clapping, some even cheering, the air electric with the feeling that maybe, just maybe, her grip was finally loosening. But Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. Quietly, and the look in her eyes as she gathered her binders and stormed out told me everything. I hadn't seen the last of her, not by a long shot, and sure enough, within days, she escalated to her most desperate move yet, dragging lawyers into the mess, mailing us legal-sounding letters full of threats, citing obscure HOA clauses, and claiming we owed thousands in fines. But what she didn't realize, and what filled me with a grim sort of satisfaction, was that every one of those letters, every false claim, every intimidation tactic was building a stronger case against her, because my wife, meticulous and methodical, was documenting everything, consulting quietly with her own legal contacts at the department, and setting the stage for Karen's entire empire of pettiness to implode. And though it was exhausting to live under her constant shadow, there was also a growing sense of inevitability, like watching storm clouds gather, knowing the thunder was coming, but also knowing we'd be ready when it hit. And when the storm finally broke, it wouldn't just be about us anymore. It would expose the entire rotten foundation of Karen's reign. The so-called legal war Karen tried to start began with a barrage of envelopes that arrived in our mailbox like clockwork, each one thicker and more pompous than the last, printed on fancy letterhead she must have ordered online, stuffed with legal jargon she had clearly copied and pasted from the internet, and at first glance it might have intimidated someone who didn't know better, but when my wife spread the papers across the kitchen table, highlighting the contradictions and laughing softly at the misuse of statutes, I realized Karen was bluffing, trying to drown us in paperwork to wear us down. Yet what she didn't understand was that my wife dealt with far worse manipulations in courtrooms and investigations on a daily basis, and she knew how to cut through smoke and mirrors with surgical precision. So instead of panicking, we organized, creating a binder labeled Karen Files with tabs for every notice, every flyer, every false accusation, even screenshots of her posts on the neighborhood Facebook group where she called us lawless thugs endangering property values. And while I was tempted to fire back, to post rebuttals, or storm into HOA meetings with counterattacks, my wife's strategy was to stay silent, let Karen rant, let her overextend, because silence in the face of lies often makes the liar louder, and the louder Karen got, the more people began to see her for what she really was. And sure enough, within weeks her obsession with us had consumed her entirely. So much so that she neglected her other self-imposed duties, failing to file HOA paperwork on time, ignoring genuine maintenance issues like the broken swing set at the park or the potholes in the community lot, and neighbors began murmuring about her incompetence, about how she spent more energy stalking us than actually helping the neighborhood, and I started to see a shift, subtle at first, but real, as people who once tolerated her now rolled their eyes, refusing to attend her emergency meetings, dismissing her frantic flyers as junk mail. And though she didn't notice, her kingdom was cracking at the seams, but like all tyrants who sense their control slipping, she doubled down, showing up on our property more frequently, this time with a smartphone held high, recording videos of our yard, our driveway, even through the windows when she thought no one was watching, and the invasion of privacy was infuriating. Yet every time I reached for the door to confront her, my wife would stop me with a hand on my shoulder and say, "Let her record. The more she does, the more evidence we have when this goes to court." And she was right, because eventually Karen crossed a line she couldn't spin her way out of, and it happened on a Thursday evening when I came home from work to find two police cruisers once again parked out front, officers standing awkwardly in the yard while Karen ranted at them about how she had proof we were harboring illegal materials in our garage. And when I pushed through the growing crowd of neighbors to reach the porch, I found her shouting about hazardous chemicals and dangerous equipment, her phone waving in the air with grainy zoomed-in footage of nothing more than lawn tools and fertilizer. And this time, the officers didn't even try to humor her, one of them turning to me with an apologetic look and muttering, "We got called for this nonsense," while my wife, in uniform again since she had just come off duty, stepped forward and calmly asked Karen if she was seriously making a false hazardous materials claim, because if so, she was liable for wasting emergency resources, and Karen's confidence faltered for the briefest moment before she launched into another rant, but the officers weren't buying it, and the lead one finally told her that unless she had actual evidence, she needed to stop calling them out for petty HOA disputes. And that was when one of the neighbors, emboldened by the ridiculousness of it all, shouted, "She's wasting everyone's time. Arrest her already." And the ripple of agreement that followed was like a tide washing over the block. People fed up, their patience drained, their voices louder now, and Karen's face twisted into fury as she spun around, shrieking that the entire neighborhood was ungrateful, that without her it would descend into ruin. But the shouts of neighbors drowned her out, and the officers, clearly tired of the charade, gave her one last warning before leaving, muttering about filing a report for misuse of emergency services. And as Karen stormed off again, defeated but not destroyed, I felt a strange calm settle over me, because the cracks in her armor were now visible to everyone, not just us, and my wife, sliding her badge back onto her belt, leaned close and whispered, "She's unraveling faster than she knows." And she was right, because what had started as her attempt to control us had now snowballed into her own downfall. And though she wasn't finished yet, the walls around her little empire were collapsing brick by petty brick, The unraveling of Karen's grip on the neighborhood became impossible to ignore after the hazardous materials stunt backfired, because by then the community had grown tired of her antics, and instead of quietly gossiping behind blinds, people began openly challenging her in the streets, at meetings, even on the community Facebook group, where before she had dominated every conversation, and the shift was palpable. Suddenly, posts mocking her emergency alerts were getting more likes than her. Official notices, neighbors were organizing barbecues and gatherings without inviting her, and kids were even making jokes about her clipboard of doom. But the real turning point came when a coalition of neighbors decided to push back formally, drafting a petition to call for her removal from the HOA board entirely, something no one had dared attempt before. And when word spread that Mr. Lawson, Mrs. Delaney, and the young couple across the street were spearheading it, signatures piled up, faster than anyone expected. Because it turned out nearly everyone had their own Karen horror story, from the single mom who got fined for leaving a kiddie pool out overnight to the retiree who was threatened with eviction over improper window blinds. And as I watched the signatures grow, I felt a mix of pride and disbelief that the neighborhood was finally standing up to her. But of course, Karen didn't take it lying down. She stormed into houses demanding people retract their signatures. She posted venomous rants accusing the petition organizers of forming a cabal, and she even printed flyers declaring that lawless elements were conspiring to destroy the neighborhood, plastering them on stop signs and mailboxes until kids tore them down, laughing as they crumpled them into basketballs for the hoop in the cul-de-sac. And though it was satisfying to see her desperation laid bare, there was also a dangerous edge to it, because her behavior grew more erratic by the day, her visits to our property more frequent, her accusations wilder, and the tension in the air heavier like the calm before a thunderstorm. And then came the night that proved just how far she was willing to go, when I woke up at 2 in the morning to the sound of scratching at the side gate. And at first I thought maybe it was a raccoon, but when I peered through the blinds, my stomach dropped, because there she was, Karen, crouched low, with a flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other, trying to peer into our backyard as if she were gathering evidence for some twisted case. And the sight of her trespassing in the dead of night filled me with such rage that I nearly tore out the door. But my wife's hand shot out, gripping my arm, whispering fiercely, "No, let me." And within seconds, she was pulling on her duty jacket, slipping her badge into view, and storming out the back door with the commanding authority of someone who had made a career of catching suspects red-handed. And the moment Karen's flashlight beam caught the gleam of the badge, she froze like a deer in headlights, her face pale, her phone trembling in her hand as my wife barked, "What are you doing on this property at 2 in the morning?" And Karen stammered some nonsense about safety checks and verifying compliance. But her excuses sounded ridiculous, echoing through the dark. And when my wife told her flatly that she was trespassing, that this was criminal, Karen panicked, bolting toward the street, with her phone still recording, screaming into the night that she was being attacked. And the commotion drew porch lights up and down the block, sleepy neighbors peeking out to see Karen stumbling in her nightgown, hair wild, shrieking incoherently as she waved her phone like a torch. And though she escaped into the shadows before the police arrived, her behavior had been witnessed by enough people that the story spread like wildfire the next morning, solidifying her reputation not as a strict leader, but as a full-blown menace. And when the petition organizers went door to door that weekend, the remaining hesitant signatures flowed in without resistance, because by then everyone understood that this wasn't about rules or property values anymore. It was about stopping a neighbor who had lost touch with reality. And as the petition deadline loomed, Karen grew more frantic, plastering her windows with angry posters declaring her innocence, leaving ranting voicemails on neighbors' answering machines, and even trying to corner me at the mailbox, where she hissed that if the petition succeeded, she would bring the full force of the law down on me, a threat that might have rattled me months earlier, but now only made me shake my head, because I knew the law was on our side, literally living in my house wearing a badge. And as the day of the HOA board vote approached, the tension in the neighborhood felt like the build-up to a courtroom drama, with Karen pacing, like a caged animal, clutching her clipboard as if it could save her, while the rest of us waited for the gavel that would finally decide whether her reign would end or if she'd somehow claw her way back into power with one last desperate stunt. The HOA board vote that would decide Karen's fate was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in the community clubhouse, and from the moment I woke up that day, I felt the weight of anticipation buzzing in the air like static before a storm. Because everyone knew it wasn't going to be a normal meeting where people debated landscaping budgets or pool maintenance. This was a showdown, the culmination of months of tension, petty battles, late night confrontations, and police calls, and as my wife buttoned up her crisp uniform, not because she had to, but because she wanted to make a silent statement that authority and truth stood in our corner, I could see in her eyes the same determination she wore when preparing for court testimony, that calm readiness to stare down chaos and bring it to order. And when we walked down the street toward the clubhouse, we weren't alone because neighbors streamed out of their houses too, some carrying lawn chairs in case the seats ran out, others holding petitions or just coming to witness history. And by the time we arrived, the clubhouse was packed to the walls, the air thick with chatter, the petition organizers sitting proudly in the front row with their stacks of signatures. And then there was Karen standing at the podium like a general before battle, her clipboard clutched in both hands, her face set in a defiant scowl as she scanned the crowd, her eyes landing on me with a glare so sharp it felt like she wanted to cut me in half. But the power she once wielded was gone, because instead of hushed obedience, the crowd murmured with open impatience, rolling eyes, and whispered jokes about her midnight escapades, and when a meeting was called to order, it was clear Karen intended to filibuster her way out of defeat, launching into a tirade about community decay, outsiders who refused to follow standards, and a conspiracy to destroy the HOA. But her words, which once might have cowed people, now sounded hollow and desperate. And even when she slammed her clipboard down to emphasize her point, the only response was a few groans and a cough from the back. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the presentation of the petition, which Mr. Lawson carried to the front like it was a crown jewel, his voice steady as he announced that nearly 80% of the neighborhood had signed in favor of removing Karen from the board, and the applause that erupted was so loud it drowned out Karen's screech of protest, her arms flailing as she shouted that the signatures were fraudulent, coerced, even forged by anarchists, a claim so absurd that laughter rippled through the crowd. And my wife, sitting tall in her uniform, leaned forward just enough to catch Karen's eye, her calm presence like a silent reminder that lies carried consequences, and that seemed to unnerve Karen more than anything, because her voice wavered as she tried to regain control, stammering that she alone knew what was best for the neighborhood, that without her it would collapse into crime and chaos. But the people had made up their minds, and when the board president, a weary man who had tolerated Karen's antics far too long, finally called for the vote, the outcome was swift and decisive. Every hand but hers raised high to strip her of her position, and the roar of approval that followed shook the room, neighbors clapping each other on the back, smiling in relief, while Karen stood frozen, her mouth open in disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend that her reign was truly over. And then, in the most surreal twist of all, she bolted from the podium, storming toward the exit while shrieking that the vote was invalid, that she would appeal, that none of us had heard the last of her. And the image of her storming out with her clipboard rattling against her side like a broken shield would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. But even as the room celebrated, I felt a nagging unease because people, like Karen, rarely went quietly, and though she had been stripped of her title, I could see in her wild eyes as she vanished into the sunlight that she wasn't finished, that she would try one last desperate move to claw back the power that had slipped through her fingers. And as my wife later said while we walked home, her boots clicking against the pavement, that's not the end. People like her always try one last card. We'd better be ready when she plays it. The days following Karen's ousting from the HOA board were oddly quiet, almost too quiet, like the calm that settles over a battlefield after the smoke clears, but before anyone is sure the fight is really over. And at first the neighborhood embraced that silence with relief, people throwing block parties, kids riding bikes without parents worrying about fines for leaving toys in the driveway, and even the lawns that Karen had once obsessively monitored began sprouting with individuality. Colorful gardens, lawn gnomes, and quirky decorations that had been suppressed for too long, and it felt for a brief, golden moment like the neighborhood was alive again, free from the suffocating grip of her rules, but the absence of her presence was haunting, because no one had actually seen much of her since the vote. She kept her blinds drawn and her car hidden in the garage, and when she did emerge, it was only in quick bursts, darting to her mailbox or trash bins with her head low, though. There was always that unmistakable glint of rage in her eyes, the kind that promised she hadn't forgiven or forgotten. And I remember one particular evening when I stepped out to water the lawn and saw her standing across the street in the shadows, just watching, clipboard gone but phone clutched tightly, her face pale, and her lips moving as if she were muttering to herself, and the sight of her sent a chill down my spine, because it didn't look like defeat. It looked like plotting and sure. Enough, the plotting revealed itself days later when envelopes began showing up in mailboxes again, not official notices anymore, but rambling, handwritten letters filled with accusations of corruption, betrayal, and conspiracies against her, claiming she had been unlawfully removed and that she was preparing a lawsuit against the HOA, against the petition organizers, and against me specifically, which would have been laughable if it hadn't been accompanied by other signs of her unraveling, like the time one neighbor caught her sneaking around the community pool at midnight with a camcorder, muttering about evidence collection, or the time someone found crudely drawn posters taped to lampposts reading, "Save our neighborhood." Reject the traitors, complete with a list of names she had scrawled at the bottom, mine circled in thick red marker, and while some neighbors dismissed it as the last gasps of a woman spiraling out of control, my wife didn't underestimate her for a second, because she knew from experience that cornered people were dangerous, that desperation often led to recklessness, so she doubled down on caution, checking the locks twice every night, adjusting the security cameras, and even coaching me on what to say if Karen tried to bait me again. And though I trusted her judgment, I couldn't shake the growing knot in my gut that Karen wasn't just going to fade into obscurity, she was building toward something, and that something became terrifyingly clear. One Friday evening when, just as we were settling in to watch a movie, flashing red and blue lights once again lit up our street, sirens cutting through the night, and I remember sighing in disbelief as I looked out the window to see not one but three police cruisers pulling up, officers stepping out cautiously, their hands resting near their holsters, and behind them was Karen, triumphant and wild-eyed, waving her arms and shouting that she had finally caught us, that she had proof of criminal activity inside our home, and before I could even process what was happening, she pulled out a key, the very same spare she had once stolen, and tried to hand it to the officers, insisting they use it to enter immediately, and the sight of that single key dangling in the air sent my blood boiling, because it wasn't just harassment anymore, it was invasion, violation, a blatant attempt to shatter the safety of our home. But before I could open the door, my wife was already there, standing tall. In her uniform, her badge glinting under the porch light, and when the officers saw her, their posture shifted instantly, hesitation flashing across their faces as Karen's voice cracked mid-rant, because no matter what nonsense she had spewed, there was no denying the reality of who stood before them, a decorated officer of the law calmly asking, "Do you have a warrant?" And the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Karen sputtering as she tried to wave the key again, insisting that it gave them permission, only to falter when one of the younger officers reminded her that possession of a key did not constitute legal access, especially not without consent from the actual homeowners, and the moment hung there surreal and electric as Karen's last desperate gambit crumbled before her very eyes. And yet, instead of backing down, she shrieked that it was all part of the conspiracy, that even the police had been compromised, her voice breaking into sobs as neighbors gathered on their porches to watch, their phones out recording, capturing the exact moment Karen's empire of delusions collapsed under the weight of reality. The scene outside our house that night felt like something out of a surreal play, with Karen standing in the middle of the street, clutching that stolen key, like it was the Holy Grail, her face twisted in fury and desperation, while three police cruisers idled with their lights strobing red and blue across every surface, and neighbors crowded their porches and sidewalks like an audience at a public execution, recording every second as proof of just how far she had fallen, and in the center of it all stood my wife, calm and commanding in her uniform, her voice cutting through the chaos with the kind of authority that made people stop mid-sentence as she demanded to know if the officers present had any lawful reason to enter our home, and when they admitted they did not, Karen screamed that the key was proof enough that she was the rightful overseer of neighborhood safety and tried to shove it into one officer's hand, but the young man just shook his head and muttered, "Ma'am, this is illegal." And in that moment, the tide fully turned. Because for months, Karen had leaned on the illusion of authority, barking orders, quoting bylaws, pretending her clipboard gave her power, but now her facade had cracked wide open, her desperation exposed for all to see. And when my wife coolly pointed out that Karen had just confessed to unlawful entry and theft of property, the stolen key, the crowd gasped, and Karen froze, realizing too late that in her mania she had said too much. And though she tried to backpedal, stammering about emergency powers and neighborhood safety, no one was buying it anymore, least of all the officers who now had their body cams recording every word. And it was in that split second, when the weight of the law came crashing down, that Karen snapped, lunging toward our porch with the key still in her hand, as if she could somehow force her way inside before reality closed in. But my wife was faster, stepping forward with one hand raised in a command to stop, her voice booming with the kind of authority that could stop a charging bull, and Karen faltered, stumbling back as the officers intercepted, grabbing her arms as she kicked and screamed, shouting that the neighborhood would regret betraying her, that she was the only thing keeping it from chaos, and the sight of her being handcuffed under the harsh red-blue glow was both satisfying and deeply unsettling because while part of me felt vindicated after all the harassment, another part couldn't ignore how far gone she looked, her hair wild, tears streaking down her face, her words dissolving into incoherent rambling about conspiracies and traitors, and as the officers led her toward the cruiser, the crowd erupted into cheers, applause echoing across the street, phones flashing, kids chanting "Bye-bye, Karen." And yet, amidst the celebration, my wife's expression remained steady, almost solemn, because she knew, what I didn't want to admit, that this wasn't necessarily the end, that people like Karen sometimes found ways to claw back into relevance, to twist events in their favor. And even as the cruiser pulled away with her in the back seat, still shrieking that she'd return, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of her, that she'd try to spin her arrest into martyrdom. But for that night, at least, we had peace. Neighbors gathered around our yard with smiles and relief, thanking us for standing firm, joking about finally being able to put pink flamingos on their lawns without fear of fines, and as I stood there with my wife's arm around me, watching the once terrifying tyrant reduced to a cautionary tale in the back of a squad car, I realized that the neighborhood had changed forever, not just because Karen was gone, but because people had finally learned the power of standing up together against someone who thrived on fear and intimidation. And though the battle had been exhausting, the victory was sweet, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, hoping, praying that maybe, just maybe, this was the closing chapter of the Karen saga. For a few blissful weeks after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood felt almost unrecognizable, the air lighter, the sidewalks filled with laughter instead of whispered complaints, and for the first time since we moved in, I actually enjoyed stepping outside without bracing myself for confrontation because people were smiling, inviting us over for coffee, even openly thanking my wife for finally putting an end to the chaos. But beneath the celebration, there was still a lingering unease because the thing about people like Karen is that they don't just vanish quietly. And though she was gone physically, her shadow still hung over the community like a stubborn storm cloud, especially once rumors started circulating that she had made bail and was back in her house under strict conditions, which meant she couldn't step foot on anyone else's property or harass neighbors directly. But that didn't stop her from scheming behind closed curtains, and sure enough, it wasn't long before evidence of her presence began creeping back into our lives, starting small with anonymous flyers shoved under doors at night, written in her unmistakable handwriting, filled with rants about illegal board takeovers and corrupt cops protecting traitors. And while most people laughed them off and tossed them straight in the trash, I couldn't ignore the fact that she still had enough fire left to try and rally support. And what worried me more was the new rumor that she had contacted some lawyer, an ambulance chaser type from a neighboring county, who she claimed was helping her sue the HOA, and several individuals, personally me included. And though I knew from experience that her case would be flimsy at best, my wife warned me not to underestimate the nuisance factor because lawsuits, even ridiculous ones, still ate up time, money, and energy, and that was exactly the kind of chaos Karen thrived on. But what we didn't anticipate was her pivot in tactics, how she shifted from being the overbearing dictator of rules to playing the victim, because soon after the lawsuit rumors, she began posting online long, rambling videos filmed from her living room where she sat in front of drawn blinds, weeping about how she had been persecuted by liars and framed by corrupt officials, claiming that the entire neighborhood had turned against her unfairly, and disturbingly, those videos began gaining attention outside of our community, with strangers commenting their support, calling her brave, saying things like "stay strong" and "you're fighting tyranny," and though the people who lived here knew the truth, it was chilling to watch her build a narrative where she was the lone hero standing against injustice. And I'll never forget the night my wife came home from a late shift, tossing her jacket on the chair with a frustrated sigh, telling me that some of her colleagues had seen Karen's videos and asked questions, not because they believed her, but because once accusations were out in the open, they had to be addressed, and that realization that Karen wasn't just content to make our neighborhood miserable anymore, that she was now trying to stain reputations and drag people down with her, made the hair on my arm stand up because it meant this wasn't just about HOA rules or trespassing anymore. It was about escalation, and sure enough, escalation came knocking one Saturday afternoon when a group of cars none of us recognized rolled slowly down our street, parking near Karen's house, their passengers emerging with cameras and notepads, murmuring to each other as they glanced at our homes. And when I asked one of them what was going on, he smirked and said they were independent journalists investigating Karen's claims of corruption and abuse, and that's when it hit me. She had managed to draw outsiders into her fantasy, people willing to amplify her story without context, and as I watched them set up tripods in her driveway, while she stood proudly on her porch giving some kind of dramatic statement, I realized that while we had defeated her in our neighborhood, she was trying to build a stage far bigger than any of us anticipated, one where her delusions could take root in front of an audience who didn't know the truth. And in that moment, the sense of victory I had felt after her arrest crumbled into dread, because Karen wasn't finished, not by a long shot, and her final act was only just beginning. The arrival of Karen's so-called supporters turned what should have been the end of a nightmare into a whole new battle, because suddenly our quiet little neighborhood, once the stage for her petty HOA dramas, had become a circus with strangers camping on the sidewalks, filming B-roll of manicured lawns, and knocking on doors to interview victims of the corrupt HOA coup, their words dripping with bias because Karen had already fed them her twisted script, and while most of us shut our doors in their faces, a few curious neighbors gave guarded comments that were later edited online to make it sound like Karen had been railroaded. And the first time I saw one of those clips surface on YouTube with dramatic music and a title like "Brave Woman Stands Alone Against Corrupt Police-Backed HOA," I felt a knot of rage in my chest, because there on screen was my wife's face blurred just enough to avoid legal trouble, but recognizable to anyone who knew her, painted as some kind of villainous enforcer. And though she brushed it off, telling me that truth always wins in the long run, I could see the anger in her clenched jaw, the way she double-checked the locks every night, because Karen had crossed a line that wasn't just about property anymore. It was about reputation, safety, and dignity, but ironically, the same thing that made Karen dangerous, her inability to stop talking, was what ultimately destroyed her, because the more she filmed, the more erratic her claims became, until even her online followers started questioning her stories, wondering why she kept contradicting herself, why one week she claimed we were drug dealers hiding contraband in our garage, and the next week said we were federal informants planted to dismantle her sovereign leadership, and while she flailed online, the legal system caught up in the real world because the arrest hadn't gone away. The charges for trespassing, harassment, misuse of emergency services, and theft of our key were still very much alive, and when her court date arrived, the same neighbors who had once trembled at her clipboard showed up in droves to testify against her, each recounting their own horror story in painstaking detail, From the retiree fine for wind chimes to the single mom stalk during school drop offs, and when my wife took the stand in full uniform, calmly describing how Karen had tried to manipulate the police into entering her home with a stolen key, the courtroom was dead, silent, even the judge staring over his glasses with disbelief at the sheer audacity of it. And in that silence, Karen finally seemed to realize there was no bluffing her way out, no speech or flyer or video that could undo the mountain of evidence against her. And when the gavel came down with a guilty verdict on multiple counts, a wave of relief rippled through the neighborhood like a collective exhale. But for me, the real moment of closure came weeks later after the dust settled when the moving truck pulled into her driveway and her family, relatives we'd barely seen before, hurriedly loaded her belongings, their faces tight with embarrassment, while Karen herself sat in the passenger seat, staring daggers out the window at all of us gathered on our lawns, too proud to admit defeat, but too powerless to stop it. And as that truck rolled away, the block erupted into spontaneous applause, not out of cruelty, but out of sheer relief that the nightmare was finally, undeniably over. And in the days that followed, our community truly came alive. Gardens flourished, barbecues filled the air with laughter, kids chalked the sidewalks with colorful drawings, and for the first time since moving in, I felt what home was supposed to feel like, a place of peace instead of a battlefield. And though sometimes I still catch myself glancing at her old house, half expecting to see her figure lurking the window with that clipboard, I remind myself of the truth. We stood our ground. We didn't let her fear tactics win, and my wife, calm, fierce, unshakable in her uniform, proved that justice, though sometimes slow, always has the final word. And in that victory, our neighborhood didn't just survive, Karen. It grew stronger, closer, and ready to face whatever storms might come next together.